Welcome to the podcast from Cold to Close. My name is Saeed and I'm the founder here at SRC Growth Partner, a company that works with professional services firms from around the world to help them increase their revenue and profitability by acquiring new clients. My guest today is John Berg. John is the CEO of Kelleher International, an elite matchmaking firm. As CEO, he has orchestrated remarkable progress, revamping the company's purpose, values, and business planning. Under his leadership, the 30-year-old company has nearly doubled in revenue and tripled profit. He's a seasoned business leader whose distinguished career spans advertising, publishing, and matchmaking, marked by consistent success in transforming and growing organizations through values-based leadership and cultural innovation. He went from assistant account executive to executive vice president at BBDO in just 14 years, which made him the youngest board member in the agency's history. During his early career in advertising, he shaped strategies for iconic brands including Hershey's, Pizza Hut, and Dell. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, the pleasure's mine, I think. Just from that little bio of yourself and that background of yourself, you've had a very successful career so far, and it's only seems to be getting more and more successful in your time at Kelleher International. So I'm really looking forward to being able to have quite an interesting conversation around all things business today and culture and growing organizations. I guess the best place I like to start is a bit about yourself and your origin story, and something that I haven't already said in terms of the introduction. So I was wondering if you could maybe give a brief background on your journey to where you are today and the current role you play within the business and what Kelleher International does.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think as far as a little bit of an origin story, I spent I think I was in an argument with my parents when I was probably 10 years old, and my parents were pretty impressed, I guess, with the logic of the argument that I was laying out as a 10-year-old. And they said, well, you're going to be a lawyer one day. So I really spent right up until I graduated from college thinking that I was bound for law school and going to be a lawyer. Late in the game, I sort of had an epiphany that that wasn't what was meant for me, and was looking around for something to do with a political science degree. And advertising agencies were looking for people who had liberal arts backgrounds who could kind of think on their feet, write, present, and so on. And so I wound up in a training program in New York City with something, and I had no real idea of advertising, but I wound up at what was the most famous advertising agency in the world at that time, called Doyle Dane Bernbach. And a lot of people think Bill Bernbach was the father of sort of modern advertising and creativity, and so it was a great place to start. I thought I would do it for a couple years and then figure out what I was going to do. And I wound up making a career out of it. You mentioned publishing. About halfway through my career, I had the opportunity to go be a group publisher at Wenner Media, which is Rolling Stone magazine, and so on and so forth. And it was the kind of opportunity that you have to take in a way. So, but I realized quickly that advertising was really my first love. So I came back to advertising. And then I think what's kind of interesting maybe about my story is that instead of coming to executive leadership positions late in my career, my first job as an advertising agency president, I think I was 38 years old. And so I was running a pretty large organization at a pretty young age. I think, I sort of built my career off of mistakes, I guess, because at 38, you just can't know very much. And so, but I always had a kind of a set of values that have been very meaningful to me. And I think as a consequence of that, I've always had really good people around me who were willing to follow me and willing to kind of be part of organizations that I lead. And so that's been kind of a hallmark. And then as for Kelleher, you and I were talking about this, at one point. I don't know anything about matchmaking per se, or I didn't know. I do now, but I certainly didn't when I started. But it's this magical business that when it gets it right, which is a pretty good percentage of the time, it literally transforms people's lives. And it's the kind of thing where people are in such great debt to us, almost unimaginable debt to us when we find them their life partner or their next spouse or even just somebody who they consider to be a best friend or whatever. I mean, it's really transformative, and that's what's fun about it. That's why I've stuck around for 4 years, is because, or almost 5 years now, is because we keep getting these and telling these stories of people who've had this experience. And so anyway, it's a fun business, but it was a very well run, mother daughter legacy business that I think I was in a good position to help them
Hmm.
take it to the next level. Like a lot of businesses, I think that are founder led businesses, they reach a kind of stasis, and it takes some outside influence typically to break through that
Yeah.
kind of artificial barrier. So we've been able to do that, and we're on a tear too. Like our January, February were the best January, February. So it's kind of feeding on itself now, which is fun.
I think that's a really interesting point you raised there, and I've said it a few times on the podcast. It's the biggest bottleneck in any business is the people within it, right? And often when you're running your own business, you can be, and if you're a founder in the own business, you can be that bottleneck, right? And it's not necessarily anything against you, but like outside perspective, as you mentioned, someone who's seen something else can bring in a different realm of knowledge that they have in a different sphere, in a different industry, in a different organization, can bring it in and apply it to your business. It can really have some profound effects, like you've just stated there. And obviously that moves on to my next question is, you've had some real great success coming in as a CEO. You revamped the company's purpose, the values and business planning, a mother and daughter, as you said, and helped it grow and double revenue and triple profits, which anyone who hears that is going to go, I want to do the same thing. How did you do that? What are you doing over there, John? So what exactly did you do to help Kelleher International grow? What steps were involved? How is it that you've got them from where they were to where they are now, and having the two best months in the last 2 months in Q1?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things I would point to, maybe three core things. The first one, I think, and I always sort of look at this, and it's deeply important to me, is culture, right? Like, and I think culture comes from, I've always said, like, if you want to have a good culture, define your purpose and define your values. And then culture is just the act of living into that. And where culture really comes alive is when the organization sees you live into it when it costs you something, right? They see it's not just words on a page or a poster in the lobby or whatever, but they see you behave in a way that it shows the organization how important those things are. And when you say revamp the purpose or revamp, what I really did was I articulated what existed. Um, and I tried to put into words what people were doing so that it felt really authentic, but it also was inspiring. And so what I wrote was transforming lives. And that notion of transforming lives kind of gave it a elevation, which I think it deserved. And then the way we do that is through purposeful connection and love, right? That's sort of the what and the how. And people got really excited about that because it gave them a set of words, a language to talk to other people. What do you do? Well, like, what does Kelleher do? What do you do? Well, we're matchmakers. No. We actually transform people's lives. Like that. So step one is kind of defining. And then we talked about a set of values, which I think every company has. We tried to make them not typical and trite.
Mm,
And then what I instituted was a weekly all hands. So we're a distributed, we don't have an office.
mm,
So what we do is we have a weekly all hands meeting, and it gives the opportunity for us to talk about these things kind of perpetually, right? So they don't just become sort of secondhand or secondary. And then the second thing, which I really believe strongly in, is if you want to execute, first you have to plan, right? You have to be very good at a way of planning, that you can then execute against, right? And I think what we what I've been really tied to for quite a long time is something called traction. And I don't know if you've ever heard of traction, but
Great.
I really believe in the idea of, he gives an example in his book about something he calls picking to the stick. I don't know if you remember that or not, but basically it's the guy in the vineyard. They're looking out over the vineyard. It's time to harvest the grapes, and the task looks impossible, right? And the vineyard manager throws a stick and said, "Well, just pick to the stick." And then as soon as they make it to the stick, then he throws the stick again. And the next thing you know, they've done the whole job, right? And I think if you can break things into achievable tasks and then measure and monitor them very carefully, and get the organization around what you're trying to achieve. And again, this is one of the big lessons for Kelleher in particular, was if you have 30 things you're trying to accomplish in a quarter, you're going to accomplish none. If you have 5 things you're going to accomplish in the quarter, you're going to get them done, and then you can move on to the next 5. It's sort of that discipline, I think, that really matters. And so we've been using this discipline now. We create these basically looks at the business that go from 5 years to 1 year to a quarter to a month,
Mm.
right? And so every month, every quarter, every year, we're sort of monitoring our progress against what we're trying to achieve. And the people feel really competitive about it now too. Like if we get to the point where somebody's name is listed against one of the things we want to accomplish in a quarter,
Mm.
and it doesn't look like we're going to, I mean, they really start to, nobody wants to be in that position, right? Because so anyway, it's a very positive thing. And then the third thing is, you have to, and this goes back to what we were talking about before. You can't scale it. One of the things I learned in the business, and I've seen with really, really strong entrepreneurs, is that you can't scale yourself. Like a big part of the problem is all of the things that you did to build your company, to make payroll, to establish yourself. And so everything went through the entrepreneur, right?
Mm.
But what that does is it puts a natural limit on the company, right? And so one of the first things that I added to this is I made 2 really, really powerful hires.
Mm.
I hired a head of sales who is now the president of the company. We elevated to president. She's a phenomenon. And then I also hired a guy that I'd worked with in the past, who's one of the best marketing minds that I've ever been around, and he agreed to come join us. And it's really like, and when we go to scale to the next level, it'll be because they're able to hire people, and they're able to trust them, right? They don't need to be involved in every single decision. So it's really those 3 things that have kind of come together to create what is a really cool, growth pattern.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, and I want to piggyback off of the last point you made there in my next question, because I always say as well, and I'm still running my own organization. I'm still waiting to get that first 18 player, right? Like we're very much a startup business. We're in the first few years of our growth, we're growing, and we've got team members, but that 18 player that can really drive, and what you mentioned there, the brightest marketing mind that you've had, and then hiring that head of sales who's brilliant and phenomenal in itself. I think this is more of a selfish question to me, but how do you attract and hire potential 18 players and real 18 players? Where do you find them? How can you bring them in? How do you entice them to wanting to work for you in an organization?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. It's interesting because the woman who became president, who I brought in as head of sales, her name's Jen Wills, and she was with the company before,
Mm.
had gone away. She's a lawyer by trade. She had gone away to another opportunity. I kept hearing about her when I joined the firm. She was a star. She was great. She was all these things. And so um, I had this idea already that she was exceptional. And then what I had to do was I had to convince her that there was a great opportunity for her to come back. And then one of the things that in the process, one of the things that I did was I introduced her to a couple of people that had worked for me in the past
Mm.
because I wanted her to understand what it would be like. Yeah, hair and all. Like, what's the good? What does it mean when he gets real quiet? That kind of stuff. So anyway, but I think what ultimately got her was my my talk and vision about the culture was what I think inspired her to come back into the company. In the case of Greg Johnson, who is the marketing person, I know Greg extremely well. He knows me extremely well, right? And so that's a case where, we have extremely complementary styles and we trust each other, and so I think he was looking for an opportunity, to be in a work environment like he'd had with me before, right?
Mm.
And so, but it leads me to, like, if you're not in that situation where you're bringing in a very important person, I spend I would say a good 3 or 4 hours with references, and I do it personally, right? And I'm looking for, because what I've found over the years is that people can be very, very good in interviews,
Mm.
but they leave a trail, right? And you get very good at picking up on when a polite person is, like they say in Japan,
Yes.
a polite yes is a no,
Yeah.
right? And you're looking for, like, enthusiasm, and like when people are talking as a reference, you want them jumping out of their chair, right? You don't want them saying, well, they're yeah,
No.
sure, they're, whatever, like, um, and so I think spending a lot of time with references, and trying to get the references to match up with your instinctual um, impression of a person is really good. And then the other thing is, I think over time, this is a little bit of a cliche, but I tend to believe that you hire for you it's kind of like we just went through the NFL combine, where they guys do the 40-yard dash and all this stuff, you hire for talent, um, and then you teach for what the needs are, right?
Mm.
Like, but you
Yeah.
can't, what is it, John Wooden, is that a reference? John Wooden was the legendary basketball coach of the UCLA Bruins, but he used to say, I can't teach quickness.
Yeah. Brilliant.
And he sort of, so you look at that, and as you're building your team, it's like, just find those people that would buy into your culture, you'd love to work with, but also are exceptionally quick.
100%. I couldn't agree more. Especially in our business as well. It's a fast-paced business. We have to do a lot of things for our clients. Then there's a lot of innovation that has to be, and we have to be able to pivot. We have to be able to adapt to what is involved. And not everyone is up to it, and I absolutely love that. You can't teach quickness, and that's I'm definitely taking that. If I take anything from this podcast, I'm taking that. In terms of then, obviously, post-pandemic, post-COVID life has created a world of hybrid work, and that you yourself, you mentioned there, you've created your organization, Kelleher International, is remote primarily. You don't have an office. How do you create, define, and cultivate a strong company culture when people aren't there, right? When it's remote, when it's, how do you articulate your values, your purpose? How is it that you bring people into the fold where they understand what it means to be in the company?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I'll start my response with I don't think you can do it as well.
Mm,
I think we've given up something. You know, I think there are benefits on the other side. And I think there are benefits that employees would be very, very reluctant to relinquish. Uh, but at the same time, I don't have any doubt that we would have an even stronger company if we were in an office together, and if we were at least a big portion of the time if we were around each other. Like
mm,
I don't have any, you know. And so what we do is we try to compensate as best we can, right? But it's not a I wish I could say, I mean, I believe the company would be doing even better, like not an insignificant amount better if we were all or in a couple of offices or whatever. But that's not the case, and it's not going to be the case, right? So what I would refer to this all hands meeting, you know, we have two standing meetings a week. One is the all hands meeting, and one is the executive team meeting, and those are a sort of forcing function to make sure that we're all together. We go out of our way during those meetings to make them personal, to talk about what's going on, to ask questions, to give people the opportunity to participate. We do a special thing on birthdays and work anniversaries. We also will reward people on a I think we do it monthly, but people will get a sort of voted by their peers, approved by the management. You know, they'll get a recognition, and that recognition tends to be things other than, you know, the highest sales, or they tend to be more focused on demonstration of commitment to the culture or demonstration of commitment to our values, that sort of thing.
mm,
And frankly, it gives me and it gives Jen uh, the opportunity on a weekly basis to kind of proselytize a little bit about what we're doing and how important it is, and what happens in people's lives, and all that sort of stuff. And so I think it as good as we can do. You know, one of the things that I've learned, I'll give you a funny kind of thing that I've learned, which is if you want to do if you're a distributed workforce and you want to do an all hand, you want to get everyone physically together, don't plan to do it at the end of the year or at the end of your fiscal year.
mm.
Because you're always in a situation, no matter how well you're doing, right? You always want to close the year a little bit better, you know. And so we've actually canceled a couple of
Yeah.
these sort of get-togethers, and so I think we're going to try to time one sort of mid-year this year so that we're not in that kind of last sprint
Yeah.
situation. But I think that's important too, to find opportunities to get people together. Like, we have a very thriving Dallas operation. We have a number of people in Dallas proper. And so Jen said to me last year, you know, they're having a holiday party. Jen lives in San Francisco. She said, I think it's important that I go to that. And I said, oh my gosh, is it important? You have to be, you know. So the more the leadership can create face-to-face opportunities with people,
Mm,
I think is also important. Uh, I think we're still figuring it out, and the thing that I'm most fearful of is I think about all of the training I got by watching
mm.
and through osmosis, and happening to be around and somebody going, "Hey, John, why don't you join this meeting?" Or, "Hey, I'm working on a thing. Can you?" And it's only because I was in eyesight, right? And that's where I don't know how AI is going to solve that, but maybe it can.
I think that's a really interesting point you mentioned there, and that it goes back to I think back to my career when I first started. I started working in a top 10 accounting firm, and I remember this was pre-COVID, a long time ago now. But I remember I used to come into the office very dressed smart with a tie on, I was one of the only people that would continue to do that, and I would simply say, well, I like wearing ties, right? And I would always wear a tie into the office. Everyone would be more relaxed, unbuttoned shirt, and then maybe a blazer, most likely just a shirt. And then one day, one of the partners of the firm would come in and he had an impromptu meeting with a really big client, and he just came over to me and go, Saeed, you're dressed smart, aren't you? You've got a tie on. Come with me to the meeting, right? And honestly, the value I gained just from just being in that meeting, and as you said, learning through osmosis, you sit there and you're like, just because I was wearing a tie and I was stubborn in the fact that I was wearing a tie, but I was in eyesight as well, it gave me an opportunity to learn things that I would otherwise most likely would have been overlooked for. And I think that's a really great point. And in terms of culture and trying to get back those advantages, you don't get those advantages as much anymore in the remote environment. But obviously there are, of course, benefits. You have that geographical advantage of being able to handpick top talent from around the world just because they're not geographically located close to you. So I think that's really interesting. I mean, I want to move slightly towards your background of advertising. You've had quite a significant career in advertising and including leadership roles. I kind of wanted to ask you, how do you think your experience in acquiring new clients and new customers and managing teams translates to your current role at Kelleher International as the CEO?
Well, I think, well, two things. One, I think, how to put this best. So I feel like one of the things that in my last agency, which I was a partner in, one of the things that I said, which had bothered me for years and years and years, which is, if you know the advertising business, you know that at a pretty high stakes level, there are pitches. And basically what a client will do is a client will form a pitch. We'll usually hire a consultant. We'll bring a bunch of agencies in for a long list, if you will, which then gets narrowed down to a short list. And as you go through that process, you're meeting with the client, you're developing spec work, you're answering questions, and it generally leads to a final meeting, right? The big game, right? And there might be 3 or 4 agencies at that point, and one agency is typically going to walk away with the business, right? And that I played that game basically my whole life, and despite the fact that we were always pretty good at that game, I always thought to myself, this is the dumbest thing from a client's perspective, because you're basically putting together a beauty contest. You're leveraging the talent and the thought and the presentation ability and the theater of a group of people that you'll probably never see again or see once or twice a year. You're not getting any sense of what it's really like to work with the agency, because this is such a contrived process. So what I did was I said very publicly and very loudly, hey, pitching is nonsense. Like, any client who pitches as a way to find an agency is just a ding dong, right? And I said, rather than do that, what you should do is you should take a problem that you have. You should find an agency that you think you might like based on their credentials and their values and whatever. And you should give them that project. And you should see how they do and see what it's like to work with them. And it doesn't have to be a big project, right? And then if you like the work that they do, then give them another project. And if you like that, then give them, and you may get to a point where you decide you like them so much that you'll get married and you'll put them on retainer and you'll give them large opportunities. So, but you'll do that from the knowledge of what it's actually like, right? And from success you've co-generated.
Yeah.
And so what we did, and what I still would really espouse to people, is our first real opportunity in that world was Microsoft. We got a relatively small project from Microsoft. We started to develop a very strong relationship with their team. They were building physical stores at that time. And what happened is, as they were building those physical stores, we were doing projects. We became the agency of record for Microsoft for stores, right? which was huge. I
Mm.
mean, that one assignment was larger than the agency when I got there, right? So then you go on and you say, okay, well now what do we, so Walmart is having trouble with some of their digital advertising, and we have a contact there. We wind up getting I think the first project from Walmart was to market a local brand of ice cream exclusively in the northeastern part of the United States using digital ads, right? Digital, basically pop up ads at that time. And over a course of about a year and a half, we parlayed that into digital agency of record for all of Walmart.
Wow.
So you can imagine, but again, like I feel so passionately that the way to these sort of winner take all beauty pageants is like they're so fundamental to the business, but
Mhm.
they really don't work. So anyway, that was, and then the other thing from an advertising perspective is, what we said, our positioning was brands are going to be in the future, brands will be built more by what they do than what they say.
Yeah.
And that what they say should really be to get attribution for the things that they're doing,
Mhm.
and that's how they can really be a powerful participant in their customers' lives, right? And blah blah blah. But so anyway, the combination of those things, we built the fastest growing and then ultimately the largest independent agency in San Francisco
Wow.
over a pretty quick period of time. But I think, it goes back to me, it always goes back to what we were talking about before, like cement the culture, focus and execute, and you'll do great. And particularly if you're surround yourself with just good people who are talented, but also just good people, good humans.
I think that's again really interesting you mentioned there, because it's, to me it sounds like you translated your learnings in leadership and you apply it to advertising, and you apply it to positioning, you apply it to growing an organization, but you also apply it to how you would run a team, how you would in a future for the team, how you grow the team itself. So it's a double-edged sword in that sense, and I think that's quite interesting. So this segment of the podcast we like to call the Entrepreneur's Room. And so it's a list of questions that we ask all of our guests, and they are designed basically to help our viewers and listeners understand what business leaders and entrepreneurs, how they think, being in a leadership position. And so the first question I always ask when we're in this section of the podcast is, how are you currently spending your days as the leader of the business?
Yeah, I spend most of my time with doing two things. One, I spend my time monitoring our progress against the things we've set out to do. And then I spend most of my time with the leadership team. And then I spend a small part of my time just sort of randomly checking in on other people in the organization. So that's basically what I do. But I try to be very respectful of Jen's position. And I see, like, a lot of my role, I'm very careful to try to help her where she wants my help, but never usurp her authority. You don't want people in the organization unclear on where to look. You know what I mean? So I'll spend a lot of time with Jen, and we're also good friends. We've become good friends, so it's easy to do. But yeah, we spend a lot of time talking about the business, thinking about issues that she's facing, that sort of thing.
It's really interesting. I always love hearing that question, the answer to that question, because you always just hear, and you always hear, a lot of my time is dealing with people, right? And that's it, and that's the thing that a lot of one of the biggest learnings I've gathered from doing these podcasts is that the biggest issues you're ever going to face in a business, yes, there's external issues that are happening all the time, some outside of your control. Look at COVID and look at the pandemic. But the the biggest difficulties you're going to really struggle with on your day-to-day basis is the people side of things. It's creating the culture. It's keeping your best employees happy. It's keeping the rest of your employees happy. It's keeping the team together and functioning in the right direction. So that, I think that's really interesting. So in terms of as a CEO of the organization, what are the most important metrics to you and to the business? What is it that you're looking at? What is it that you're measuring? And what is it that you are actively
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, if you think about the way our business operates as a business, right? So if we focus on the business. Oh, by the way, this is Jen calling me right now. So,
Hi, Jen.
but if you think about our business, sort of goes on the revenue side, it goes from what we call high quality leads. And so the very first thing we have to be very mindful of is that we're getting a threshold number of high quality leads that are being distributed to our salespeople, create a close rate on those high quality leads, right? And so that's where Greg Johnson comes in, and his team is making sure that we have a steady flow of really high quality leads. And if you think about our business, those leads are tricky, right? Because we're talking about very, very wealthy people who can afford our service. And then we're talking about a subset of those people who happen to be single. Right? So it's not that hard to target wealthy people, but when you get the subset of wealthy people that are single, it becomes much more challenging. And so for us, we're really trying to get to a steady flow of high quality leads. And then what I've challenged the team and Greg with is now that we've established that we can get X number of high quality leads, the expectation is that you're going to find ways for a similar cost per lead. You're going to find ways to grow that over time, right? Because that's how we in turn grow our business, right? Then we monitor high quality leads, then we monitor cost per lead, then we monitor close rate so that we can get to cost per client, right? And that's all on the revenue side. And then on the other side of the business, we're carefully monitoring and having a conversation about customer satisfaction. And we have a variety of ways to look at that. But one of the things that we do in our executive meeting each week is we talk about actual people, right? We talk about people that maybe haven't had a date or haven't been presented with somebody in too long a period, and what are we going to do about that? And we talk about somebody who maybe went out on a date and wasn't really happy with the person that we had put them with for whatever. So we get down into the granular level of customer satisfaction, and we look to stay ahead of that. We look to where we look for ways to think that a relationship with a client might turn, and we look to get ahead of that so it never happens, right? Like we're trying, and it's a real focus of the executive team. So those are the things. And then the last thing that we look at is because particularly because some of our contracts have incentive clauses in them, but we look at these sort of milestone situations where, one milestone is when somebody goes on hold. We call that going on hold when somebody's in a serious relationship that we created, right?
Okay.
And then when somebody gets engaged, that's another significant milestone. When somebody gets married, that's a significant milestone. And so we look at those things as well. But we have a format too. This is not something that we do anecdotally. Every single week we fill out the form. We list the stuff. I get inputs from around the company, and it all gathers into a reviewable document. So it kind of keeps a history too, in a funny way. Like if you go back and look through them over time, it creates an interesting history.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think it's really interesting as well that you mentioned that even in the matchmaking world, like having incentive-based contracts in the way you work is really interesting, and going on hold and then getting engaged. It makes a lot of sense though, because you're incentivizing success in what you're doing. So that's an interesting element. I guess I didn't even think that was even a way to think about it, but that's really interesting. In terms of then how you're currently, and you touched on there in terms of getting high quality leads and putting it into a place into the pipeline so that the salespeople can actually close them. How are you currently growing the business? And obviously we talked about at the top of the show, since coming in, you've managed to double revenue, triple profits. How are you currently growing the business? What are you currently using? Is it specific channels? Is it primary meta ads? Is it Google ads? Is it email marketing? How is it that is it network marketing? How is it that you're currently growing the organization to create those really high quality leads?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the way I want to answer it, if it's okay with you, is that what what we're what we've been doing, and the sort of step one was we've been sharpening what we already do, right? Like so so the most typical things that where we would play is like Google AdWords, for example. You know, that where we're serving, and then increasing our position in organic. You know, those things are very important for us, because a lot of people when they start to think about this, they start with the internet. We also have looked hard at trying to find ways to encourage even more people to refer us, recommend us, clients, former clients, that sort of thing, because they sort of know us best. But we're doing a few things now. Greg is working on a few things now that all I would really say is that they're really quite different for the business, and they're different enough, and I think potentially successful enough, that I wouldn't want to let our competitors in on the.
Fair enough. No, that's good.
But yeah, I think I mean, the very first thing to always do though is to kind of hone, like the first play is let's see what we're doing, and let's see if we can make that 25% better.
Yeah.
Which is almost always the case.
Yeah, no, I think that we say the same thing to all of our clients and all the partners that we work with. It's you want to be the go-to-market strategy often is figuring out exactly what your favorite best clients that you currently have, what they love about you, and then go from there, being able to go, okay, how do we do that more and build from there, and then add the client acquisition channel, and then add the sales process from there. But always starting point, go to market strategy. In terms of, you've had an illustrious career over many years.
But
I didn't mean to say it in any negative connotation, but in terms of, I'm sure you have a lot of lessons that you are able to impart on, and so I guess I wanted to ask you, and I'm sure you have many lessons, and we can't go through every single one of them. What is the biggest lesson you could share with the viewers and listeners of the podcast from your experience?
Well, I think the probably one of the most important things. This is really interesting because this goes back to yeah. I had a marketing teacher who was from the Columbia Business School, and I remember one of the things I remember that I didn't understand very well at the time, but I've come to understand, is he would start every class by saying, "It's not always important what you do; it's important that you do."
Mm.
And what he was trying to say is that in his experience, there are generally several right answers, and the only real wrong answer is inaction, right? And so one of the things that I've always tried to do is I've tried to be willing to take risk and correct, like take action and correct, right? As opposed to trying to get the perfect thing, and then waiting till,
Mm.
and then years later, a guy that I worked for, who is the worldwide chairman of DDB, had an interesting corollary to that. He said, action creates action. And he said that the inverse is true as well, which is inaction creates inaction. And so and his point was, you don't always know where something is going to lead,
Mm.
but get going, right? Because what'll happen is you'll meet a person, and that person will know a person, and then that will be a reference to another thing, and the only reason that you wound up where you wound up is because you started.
Yeah.
Like you created the action that led to and being comfortable not knowing where it's going to go, but knowing that you're on the move, right, is kind of, so those two things I think are really. And then I go back to something that my dad said to me a lot when I was little, which again I understood more as an adult, which is that you are what you tolerate. And
Yeah.
it's another way of saying, what we talked about before, which is sort of living into your values, right? Like not just having them, but living them and being very clear about it, which frankly is a little challenging as an American these days. I think I worry about the way the world sees us right now. And one of the things I hope is that the world's not lumping us together. Americans, like that it sees that there's very much
Mm.
a difference. But I think that notion of you are what you tolerate, as it helps you think about how to build a culture,
Yeah.
I think is really powerful.
Yeah, no, I love both of those lessons, especially the first being the cost of doing nothing is worse than the cost of doing anything, right?
Yeah, very well put.
And I live by that in the sense that I spent a long time thinking about running a business, thinking about starting a business, but never did anything. And then when I started the business, I realized, okay, you put one foot forward, and then opportunities start arising that you would never have dreamed of, and you couldn't even make it up in your own mind. And things happen. And then inversely as well, if you didn't do anything, then you can't expect anything to happen other than what is happening to you right now. Everything is outside of your control. So I think it's really interesting. I just wanted to end on this last question, which I end every podcast with, John. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you had a magic wand you could wave to solve one business problem, what would that be?
Wow, that's a question. I guess I would go back to what we were sort of a point that we were making, which is, I would look for, I would love to be able to have the best of the flexibility that you get from being a distributed workforce, and the best of what you get by proximity to each other, right? And in my mind's eye, I'm envisioning some sort of technology holograph. I don't even know, but something that would allow for people to keep the flexibility, but
Mm,
also gain a level of proximity to each other. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but
yeah,
if I could wave a magic wand, we
yeah,
could have both, right?
yeah.
We could do both.
Best of both. Amazing. Well, John, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your time, and thank you for sharing the insights that you've shared today. I hope the viewers and listeners have enjoyed it just as much as I have. But it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. Yeah, good luck with it. And I think this podcast is a great example of, you doing something, right? Like who
Yeah.
knows what'll come
Who
of it,
knows? Who
right? But
knows?
you do it.
Yeah.
So good
Exactly
on
that.
you.
All right then.
All right.
Appreciate it. Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Bye.